the father of natural history, Ray, the father of modern taxonomy, Linnaeus, the father of modern genetics, Mendel. I mean, you have to be somebody quite special to be called the father of something, don't you? And these people were all not just Bible believers, but creationists. So let's take them one by one. John Ray, the father of natural history. Now, this is a quote from a website from the University of California, Berkeley, about him. A devout Christian, Ray expounded his belief in natural theology, the doctrine that the wisdom and power of God could be understood by studying his creation, the natural world. This doctrine can be traced back to the Bible, but Ray expressed it so fully and so clearly that he started a long tradition of natural theology in England and abroad. So these are strange terms to us these days. It's a bit difficult to get them inside one's head because we're so used now to thinking of nature divorced from theology. But what we're saying here is that this man, John Ray, and he wasn't the only one, there were quite a lot of people doing something similar to this, but he was so successful that he's called the father of it. He desired to know God. That was his motivation. It was desiring to know God and believing that the Bible taught that God could be known in his creation, that he actually established this tradition of natural theology, studying creation in order to know God. Now, Isaac Newton, who obviously was a contemporary of his, did very much the same thing. That was his motivation too. I mean, he was an unusual, one might almost say weird at times, character. But he was not an exemplary Christian in every respect, but in the way he did his science and his motivation for his science, I think he was. Because Isaac Newton too was seeking to know God. For example, he studied light because he saw in the Bible that it says God is light. So the motivation for these people came directly from the Bible. Not only that, the motivation came because they believed it was possible, and Steve Fuller describes this very well in his books. He's grasped it, even though he's not a Christian himself, that because they believed the world was created, and because they believed humans were made in the image of God, because these are things the Bible teaches that Christianity teaches, then they saw that it was possible for people to think God's thoughts after him. That expression was used by several of them. I think it was used by Newton himself, I think, when he made a discovery. I'm thinking God's thoughts after him. It was this belief that there was a God, that the world was designed, the universe was designed, people were designed, nature was designed by God, and that people had the same kind of mind as God. Obviously, God is, he's different in many respects. But the Bible teaches we're made in his image. It was this truth that they were working on. If there is no God, if everything is random, what is the reason for doing science? And Steve Fuller himself says he cannot see any reason for doing science unless you are a creationist. Now that's an unbeliever speaking. It's because of this view of the world that it's possible to study it, that it's possible to understand it, that there's something about its workings that humans might be able to describe. That is what led to the development of modern science. And John Ray was a very good example of it in this field of biology. So he wrote, some big books. One was called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. I'm not expecting you to go and read them, although you might want to, but it's really to show you the kind of thing that he wrote after all his biological work. And 3 physico-theological discourses. I think actually he preached a lot of this stuff as sermons originally. And this university website says, such deep religious feeling may seem out of place in scientific writing today, but Ray's work actually represented a huge advance for science. It has normally been Christians, or believers of some sort, usually Christians, who have taken science forward in big leaps. And his theology is strikingly different from modern biological thought. Yet his goal of a natural system of classification inspired Linnaeus and generations of systematists after Linnaeus to collect, document, and classify organisms, Ray's work began to bring order to the study of species. Now, you see, if you believe in a random world, and people did at that time, they weren't all Christians or all believers, where do you begin to study it? But if you believe, as the Bible teaches, that things are actually created in groups, that you can define groups of creatures, because that's what Genesis 1 says, then people like Ray began to look for those groups and began to impose a sort of order on what they saw out there, because they believed that that was what the setup was. And as we know, this became a very successful thing. He was what became known as a special creationist. In other words, species. In other words, things had been created in groups. That's what that essentially means, because the Bible teaches that God created in the beginning according to different kinds. So he described on this basis and classified thousands, he was a very hard worker, thousands of species of plants, birds, insects, mammals, fish and reptiles. And he based his system of classification on his observations of anatomy and physiology and the creature's environment, how it related to its environment. And he paved the way for the work of Linnaeus the following century, which leads us to Linnaeus himself. Now his name, he worked with hybrids. His name is actually a hybrid there. He started off being called Carl von Linné. He was Swedish. Ray, of course, was British English. Then he gave himself a Latin name, but it's hard to say. So sometimes it's written like this. So his name is half Swedish, half Latin, or half German, half Latin, whatever. So he was born in the following century and is known as the father of modern taxonomy. Now, it's important to realise that his work depended directly on Ray's work. He was following on from Ray and others. He was from a Lutheran background, strongly biblical background, and he gave us our modern classification system, the binomial system, where Homo sapiens would be an example. You have the genus Homo and the species sapiens. This was Linnaeus who formulated that, whose name is associated mainly with that. He was directly influenced by Genesis chapter 1 again. He was looking for the Genesis kinds again. And you'll note that he was born in 1707, so he was actually 300 years old last year. And so there were special exhibitions to do with Linnaeus last year and special write-ups. And this is, at the bottom, is a quote from that. He remained a naive believer in the Genesis account of creation, the Times newspaper said. It said how people have tried to present him as some kind of evolutionist, but they said actually it can't be done. He actually remained a naive believer in the Genesis account of creation all his life. Now, this is what is so unfair, you see. It was because he was a naive believer in the Genesis account of creation that he actually did his work. That's not taken account of or understood. And that is what I'm trying to convey. I'm not just saying these people were Christians. I'm saying it's because they were Christians. It was the Christianity that gave rise to the work that they did. So again, he was looking to see if animals were in specific groups, because he believed they were, because that was what the Bible taught. And he classified them that way because, again, he was looking for the kinds and what does the Bible mean by kind, and how do you group things, living things. So let's hear what Steve Fuller has to say about Carl Linnaeus. Now look at this. By his death in 1778, Linnaeus was widely regarded as the most significant scientist since Newton.